I think for anybody who's been watching British politics closely or from a distance will know that we've had these three big revolts in our country over the last 13 years or so. We've had the rise of Nigel Farage, who is obviously similar to other politicians in Europe, who's tapped into a sense of frustration among millions of voters with the political consensus. We've had the vote for Brexit, which shocked much of the same establishment. And then we had the rise of Boris Johnson and the realignment, John, of our politics, which obviously lots of Australians and Americans will recognize. We had lots of working class voters, lots of voters who haven't passed through university, lots of older voters moving to the Conservatives, lots of graduates, lots of younger voters, lots of social liberals moving to the left and the Labour Party. And so really what I'm trying to do with this book is explain what on earth is going on. And the answer in short is that all of these events really reflect a growing rebellion among voters, a growing sense of frustration at a new elite in British society, an elite that is very different from the old elite, and I'm sure we'll get into what those differences are, but a new elite that is essentially imposing its values on the rest of the country, is denying many people a voice in the national conversation, and is losing touch, John, with many voters in wider society. So my argument is, unless we really look at the people who are dominating the institutions in not just Britain, but Western democracies, and unless we reform those institutions and give people more of a stake in the direction of their societies, especially on these big cultural issues like immigration and identity and belonging, then we're going to see a lot more rebellions in the years to come.
Can I pick up, you mentioned the three events, Nigel Farage, populism, people didn't see that coming, and then Brexit itself, a rebellion, as you say, against elites, and then Johnson and the Red Wall. I guess a lot of people would have thought, well, surely things will settle now, but there's been something of a revolution, and Boris Johnson's become the Prime Minister. He's rewritten politics in a lot of ways. That's what the Red Wall was about. But it didn't happen. People assumed he'd bed down Brexit. He was an author of it. He was a driver of it. He passionately argued for it. And I guess people thought, well, he'll now make it work. And that's not what happened. To what extent would you say the Prime Minister Johnson was if you like, himself was the problem? And to what extent would you say it was for what Frank Furedi might call the expertocracy, the new elites, determined to frustrate it, that led really effectively to failure? It didn't work.
Yeah, I think there are two things that essentially were going on. The first is that in the aftermath of Boris Johnson's victory in 2019, the Conservative Party didn't really understand the extent to which the country's politics were being realigned. The party was given this unique electorate, this unique coalition of working class, non-graduate, older voters, cultural conservative voters. They wanted less immigration. They wanted regions outside of London invested in. They were skeptical of what I call hyper-globalization. They were skeptical of the constant prioritization of big business over national interests. And they were very anxious about the rise of radical woke progressivism, the erosion of free speech, the rise of cancel culture, the erosion of boundaries between men and women, and the constant rewriting of our national history. Now, the Conservatives could have leaned into that realignment, John. They could have reshaped their electorate for the long term, which is what I actually suggested to Boris Johnson on two occasions when I presented my research to people in and around Number 10 that they should do. That conservatism needed to reinvent itself. It needed to stay committed to this new electorate. What happened, however, is they didn't do that. And they didn't do that partly because Boris Johnson was always a bohemian. He was a cosmopolitan. He was essentially a liberal. He wasn't really a conservative. And you can see that in the policy decisions he took. He liberalized immigration from outside of Europe. He even, John, removed a requirement for British companies to advertise British jobs in Britain first. This was not somebody who understood the general direction of travel out there in the country. So that was one part of the story about how the Conservatives lost touch with this electorate. The other part, as you say, really was the way in which many of the people who dominate the institutions in this country, and I'm not just talking about politics, I'm talking about media, creative industries, cultural institutions, universities, schools, the people who determine the shape of our national conversation, who determine what is acceptable to discuss and what is not, who determine what issues dominate the conversation. They had very little interest in changing the broken status quo. They didn't want to challenge globalization. They didn't want to challenge mass immigration. They didn't want to give more of a voice to the rest of the country. We saw this time and time again in how they tried to essentially dilute Brexit to the point of it being meaningless, how they didn't reform the institutions and let other voices into those institutions. We also partly saw it during COVID, where anybody who voiced a dissenting view was stigmatized and silenced as being a crank or a lunatic. And this is really the second part of the story. And what I'm saying in this book, John, is unless we give people a sense that their values, that their voice is being respected and represented in the institutions, then what we've seen across the West over the last 20, 30 years, and I've been studying politics for a long time, what we see in Britain and France with Marine Le Pen, or Italy with Giorgia Meloni, or the Sweden Democrats, or Donald Trump, or Vox in Spain, or Chega in Portugal, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Law and Justice in Poland. What we've seen over the last 20 years, I think, is just going to accelerate as this new elite shows itself unable to really compromise with many voters in their own countries and deliver the changes these people want to see.